Hello and welcome to this Labor Day Monday, a very solemn, or should be a very solemn time to reflect upon the fallen of people in the military and other, it's all military. I guess we want to include other people too, like people who fight fires and people who drive ambulances and all that. I guess the people who serve our country. And taking time to remember the sacrifice that they did. And so despite all the beginning of summers and the barbecues and all that stuff, I choose to look at this day with a little bit of quiet. So now that said, here we are in week 3 of developmental psych, and chapter 3 happens to be infancy and toddlerhood. And I have to tell you, you start studying infancy and toddlerhood and it's pretty hard to stay somber. This is an extremely interesting age to study. There's lots of things going on, lots of biology, lots of cognitive development, lots of emotional development, and in the assessments, I'm going to have you be looking at pieces of that. So first, let's look at the discussion that I'm having you contemplate. Now, it's important to recognize that in Erikson's theory, his stages actually coincide, the first 4 coincide somewhat with Freud's first stages in his psychosexual theory. Erikson comes along as a student of Freud, and in part of their separation of ideas was he changed that to psychosocial. That the driving force of change in a human being was the interaction between the psyche and the social environment, rather than Freud's viewpoint about the psyche and the emerging sexual function of reproduction and survival of the species. So now we're looking at Erikson, and we're looking in that early development, and what he also took from Freud was that these particular early stages are vital. They're foundational. Things go wrong in early childhood, things have a tendency to stay wrong. It's sort of a characteristic of Erikson's theory. If you're somewhere off the middle, good or bad, it influences the next stage to be good or bad as well. So if you started off really good in trust, then moving on to stage 2 in autonomy tends to be okay. If you go mistrust, might move on to the next stage and move more into a lack of autonomy or a sensation of guilt. So, I think it's guilt. So in this first discussion, we're looking at those first two, the development of trust and the development of autonomy. So you have to read up on those and then discuss the importance of these 2 stages in terms of how those might manifest later in life. I mean, this is basic trust. It's not, I've been burned so many times by relationships. That's a different kind of issue. That'll come up later in Erikson's theory. But in this particular stage, we're talking about a fundamental, am I welcomed on earth? And can I trust people around me to meet my needs? Really, really fundamental stuff. What if something goes wrong? What if something goes right? How do we see that manifest later in life? And then autonomy. There's actually first steps toward independence. What if that goes wrong? What if that goes right? Having some ideas about and discussing some ideas about how those things can go right and wrong. Then we move into the quiz that talks about, so that was the social development, social emotional development. And then we look in the quiz, I'm examining some of the biological changes, an important part of brain development, and then bringing up, of course, Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development. So the first question I'm asking you about is something that has started in utero and continues into infancy and toddlerhood, and that is the myelination of the nervous system. Now, myelin is a fatty substance that builds around the axons and around the nervous system. It has a function to protect, and it has another function What happens? What's the difference between a myelinated nervous system and an unmyelinated nervous system? And I'm telling you that that difference means that a myelinated system is needed for us to develop coordinated complex movement. Tell me why. It's a very straightforward question, and I want you to do it. Don't just say, this is why. Just, write a sentence saying, myelinated nervous systems are blank, 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 and therefore that is why we are able to have coordinated complex movement. An unmyelinated system is what we have when we're infants and we can't do a whole lot. We're just kind of like waving our arms around. That coordination is not there. Then I have you reflect upon the two processes that Piaget talked about that are fundamental to learning and development, and that is the process of assimilation, where you're bringing in new information, and in the phrase that he used, you build a schema, an internal representation of that, and then accommodation, and that is when new information comes in, and faced with that new information, we have to make changes to existing schemas. So one is new ideas, the other one is the effect of those ideas, or maybe other things or new information on existing schemas, such that we have to accommodate or change those ideas in order to take into consideration that new information. And with this one, I'm asking for examples on your own learning experiences. Even though Piaget focuses a lot of his cognitive development theory on early childhood, the processes of accommodation and assimilation are lifelong. You experience that lifelong. You go into anatomy and physiology and you're learning new terms for things, but you're being exposed to some information that you already have. You already know you have a skeleton, but then that schema of skeleton over the term of the course becomes increasingly modified as you're adding information to it. So if somebody asked you at the beginning of the class, describe, bone structure, you'd have this much. At the end of class, you're like, I have this much. You've actually changed that internal representation through the process of accommodating the existing schema. Now, don't use A and P. You're not allowed to use that. But I want you to give an example of when you've learned something brand new, and then when you've learned additional information where you've had to modify an existing schema. Lifelong processes every time we learn something. So, that's it for this week. This is the Chapter 3 content. Please enjoy the outdoors this summer. I think it's going to be a beautiful week. It was certainly a beautiful weekend. And have a great week and be well. And I will see you next time.